Nikhil, thank you for coming in. You definitely are an outstanding, prominent figure in computer science and innovation globally. You've got just a marvelous career, and you're Chief Innovation Officer at Tech Mahindra, which is globally well known for all of the marvelous technology advancements that you're leading. You're based out of India, but your work is really appreciated and respected globally. So we're going to get into all of this journey and all the contributions you've made over your marvelous career. So thank you for coming in to do this interview.
No, thank you, Stephen. Thank you for having me.
So Nikhil, now one of the questions that my audience is interested in, my audience, by the way, skews towards CEOs and board members and people like that and investors, but they're really always interested in what made you who you are today, because you have just a wonderful success history. What are maybe one, two, or three inflection points in your life? And it could have been when you were like 5 or 6, or when you're sort of the junior grades to university, to maybe some of the inflection points that happened in your career, but maybe 3 at the most that made this wonderful person and all the marvelous contributions you have right now. So
yeah, so if you would have asked this question, Stephen, to my mother, she would have said I was the black sheep of the family. So I think it's probably the facet to think something out of the box and probably be a rebel. And I've written down in my book that I published about in 2021 of obviously within COVID. I had nothing better to do, but I wrote a book on myself saying, look, what is the act of innovation? And I think the more I go back and think about it, it was that rebel nature. But I think one of the best things that happened to me was I was allowed to persist that rebel nature by my parents, number one. Number two, I think there were so many people to thank of and get inspired from during my lifetime. My teachers, there were some, great people like Jobs. And I followed Jobs very, very closely when he actually did innovation. And the kind of Apple iPhones that we used when we were using 2Gs and 3Gs to what we have today, which is iOS 13 or 14, has really transformed what we can look at communication and in terms of connectivity. So I think there were loads of them in terms of my life and who inspired me to do that. But I think the single most important thing that led me over here, and which I also put in my book, was courage. It is genetics as well. I come from north of India, and we are normally very impulsive in terms of taking decisions. And if you look at a simple copyrighted system, it says, think before you act. We act before we think. And sometimes those actions actually speak louder than certain words that people want to do. I think those are 3 or 4 things that made me what I am today at this point, Steve.
So I'm hearing that you were sort of the outlier in the family.
Yeah, always have been, always have.
And then we're seeing that, as you mentioned, because of the sort of the area of India that you're born in, and it made you this sort of a very assertive, focused on execution and doing things out of the box. And then you'd be inspired by people like Steve Jobs and others. So I can see now how that makes up your career. Now, you're Chief Innovation Officer, Tech Mahindra. What does that mean?
Yeah, no, so I think that role came after 7 years of my when I joined Tech Mahindra. I was part of IBM before that, 2004, 2003, and really my tryst with technologies and AI started with IBM, right? So I also worked at Watson, so my ideology of how AI needs to happen was there. I spent quite a bit of time in US as well. It was 4 years before I came back to India in 2014, and that was providence. I think India was changing. There was a new government at the helm. It was opening up, and I wanted to do something very different and not do the same old stuff that I wanted to do with customers. So I came back to India and started this research division, right, which gave me the ability to become the innovation officer at that time. But the ideology was very simple, Stephen. The ideology was, and that goes back to my background, right, which was the rebel nature. Can we do something different? Can we ensure that R&D, research and development, and something that we keep talking about, and for what US is obviously known for, right? Ample resources, good research and development. Can it happen back in India, and can it happen for India and from India as well, so that it serves our customers better? So I think that was the pivotal point I'm very grateful that my management recognized it. Obviously, my CEO, CP, and some of the others recognized it. And that's what got me the label of Chief Innovation Officer, right? So it's also the Chief Disruptive Officer, if you would ask him, because that's where the whole idea of disruption and innovation go together.
It's interesting, you talk about, being at IBM and that sort of fostering where you are today, but you're also in the burgeoning of a country, India, which is just breaking out. I mean, from a creativity standpoint, innovation, if you look at a lot of the big tech companies around the world, they happen to be led by people of Indian origin. So, and then all of these startups that are occurring in India. In fact, I'm helping with a IEEE conference. We decided to put it into India because of just all the innovation that's occurring. And in fact, we're focusing on innovation. That's really the centerpiece of this major conference, global conference in India. And India is now the most populous country in the world. So
yes,
what are your thoughts about the future of India? Because you're driving that future of India as well.
I think from a world's lens view, when you look at India, you look at it from a demographic dividend perspective, which is definitely there, right? I think the kind of youth and the amount of youth that we have surpasses any other country today. But I think one thing that people are missing out is the access to information that has improved in India. And that is where innovation in India is today happening in rural sectors than in urban sectors. If you go to urbanized cities in India, you would find a lavish life. You would find people well endowed with tablets and phones, and we have got almost a very cardless and a cashless kind of a system today for payment, right? You go even to a vegetable vendor in India, you can actually pay through your phones. You don't need cash. You don't need cards in your pocket. So that's changed India in the urban way. But I think the driving force for India is the rural sector. And I can give you hundreds of examples. I'm actually part of a commission which was set up by Atal Incubation Center. AIC, or Atal Incubation Center, is something which the government has put up to foster innovation in all parts of the country, not just urban, but also some of the tier 2 and tier 3 cities. And I was talking to these 4 young kids who come from a very remote corner in the central part of this country. And these 4 kids have to travel 45 kilometers every day, walk to their school, right? To and fro. And one day, you may call it scientific serendipity, or you may call it some providence, right? They drop red amaranthus, green amaranthus, and millets on a piece of land. That land sprouts weeds. They take that weed and the leaf, and they actually crush it into a juice. With that juice, they were able to solve about 99% of malnutrition in that region. Now, this kind of innovation doesn't happen often. This kind of innovation, strives itself from the need of people, because they have access to information, because they know that this could be done. They're actually changing the way India is probably looking at. So they came to me and they said, look, we've done this innovation. What do we do? I said, you've already done it. We can't tell you more, except that selling juice, which is much more unhygienic, why don't you ground them into some kind of, dried powder, put them into sachets? It appears much more better. And one of the kids remarks me incidentally, had I known English, I would have taken this to the rest of the world as well, because this particular combination of seeds is fruitful for anybody across the world. So I came up with that was probably the scenario when we came up with an editor, Stephen, which allows rural kids to code in the language of their own choice. Today, India has about 27 dialects, 27 mother tongues, and 1,600 odd dialects in which we converse. And English is spoken by only 20% of people. So we said, let's close that digital divide. So my point of view is that India is burgeoning at the space of innovation. But I think what people don't realize is that India is also the fringe where you would use a lot of data to cater for the rest of the world. Because things that would not happen in the other parts of the world, you would find a specific use case somewhere in India. And that is that outlier of data that you've never considered when you're actually making your models and you're thinking about machines and so on and so forth. So that's India's prowess at this point in time, and that's what we're utilizing.
That's a really interesting perspective. So let's unpack some of what you're saying. And we know that India has the largest youth population in the world. And in fact, In contrast to the West and to China and other parts, which are aging, India on the other side has a very large, in fact, the world's largest youth population, and innovation is growing throughout that entire piece. And you gave an example. So that's kind of a really marvelous capability. And then you talked about technology and enabling more of this innovation, because there's a lot of dialects, and being able to people to work in those different dialects, and technology enables that capability. But I thought that was really interesting. You're mentioning that you get outlier cases, or because India is so large that if you're looking for use cases of particular examples, more than any other place in the world, you're going to find it in India. So, for example, then if you are trying a new kind of innovation and you want to see a lot of diversity, India is probably the best way to test it out.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And the data sets you would have too then would be so broad and diverse. Again, for example, even in the healthcare field, then it'd be a great testing center to drive that kind of innovation. So really the world should be flocking to also for India because of this diversity that occurs as well, and the talent, and you're enabling that talent. So, you've got this Makers Lab, I understand. Could you tell us more about this?
Yeah, no. Makers Lab was a name given because we actually tend to make a lot of stuff, right? We do a lot of fundamental research and development. We do translational R&D, so on and so forth. And this was actually started off in 2014. So I told you, right? So we wanted to do something different, and we were very thankful that the management at Tech Mahindra gave us this space. So this had to have a space at least when we came in, right? This space was a wet kitchen that we started off. They actually used to wash utensils, and the reason I picked up that space was because it looked like a garage. It looked like somebody, and this was unheard of, right? In those times in tech companies saying, look, you have a garage, you've got 3 or 4 people who are actually trying to do some stuff. And this is early days in 2014. So what do you do, right? So I don't know. I don't have the use cases. I've just come back from US. I'm just enamored by some of the things that I've seen in US. I know technology can work, but what exactly should you be doing? We were having tea one day, and we saw one guy fiddling with his stand on the motorcycle. So he's trying to pick his motorcycle, but his stand was not working. So back comes few of the people who were there with me saying, why not we make a bike that stands on its own? So there goes the first use case, right? So we started looking at a bike. We don't have bikes because we travel by cars in India. So we got a young kid's bike from our homes, started fiddling with it, started putting sensors. It was a big effort of 3 months. Eventually, we landed at zilch. There's nothing. We could do all kinds of science and so on and so forth, but it didn't do well. But if you now come to my Makers Lab, that bike's actually hanging on the wall. That's our first feedback or first failure, right? We considered it. Having seen that by people around us, by the organization, by companies, a lot of people started flocking in. And they said, look, we want to work in this space because it allows us to fail. It allows us to give that feedback. It allows us to try out new things, which we can probably take to our customers and, society at large. Over the last 9 years, I think Makers Lab has done some fundamental research, Stephen. When this world was going through COVID, while you heard about a vaccine from India, the therapeutic molecule behind COVID-19 was founded by my lab, right? So, and this was large amount of research that we did over a period of 1.5 years. If you come to India and you go to a farming community or a farmer, the farmer would be using an app in their own dialect and language, which is built by my lab. This actually gives a farmer ability to understand weather patterns, pesticides, ability to understand how dams are evolving, how water's there, what's the mineral source, so on and so forth. If you come to and go to a rural sector, you will see an editor being used, a code editor, which is built by my lab, which actually takes care of a lot of languages in terms of what we do. Funnily enough, the first use case by any Indian IT services company on quantum was actually done by my lab with our partners in UK, where we actually made the QKD or the quantum key distribution facet work well in terms of this. And there's an old Indian science. It's called Indian Farmers Almanac. We, I think, are the only people responsible for putting it into an algorithm and positively predicting precipitation across the world, right? So over the 9 years, I saw hundreds and thousands of these people who joined me in terms of this, this essence to create something new. Now the lab is known to everyone in India, obviously a lot of places abroad, but the kind of people who join these labs are some sort of mavericks or outliers, I might say, right? So they would be a psychologist, they would be a painter, they would be an artist, they would be a graphic designer, they would be a PhD scientist, but they yet would be a driver, an Uber driver who wants to do something very different, and he's part of the lab. And we encourage that because I think that brings that kind of diversity in thought as well in terms of what we're doing. So in a nutshell, that's Maker's Lab. It's actually a place where you can make stuff in terms of what you want to do.
So what I'm hearing is also it's very interdisciplinary, and as you mentioned, it's translational. And a lot of people don't know what that means, but it's really taking research and translating it into practical applications that people can use and solves real problems. So it's not just pure thinking; it's actually using and developing and executing on those ideas. That's an amazing history and a contribution that you're making, and then the whole world will vibrate from the energy and all of the innovation that's coming out of the lab. You know, what's intriguing though, you also mentioned quantum science. So I know you're at the intersection also of AI, but also quantum science. So describe the quantum journey that you've been on and quantum information technology and what that means, and maybe give a little bit of a base to the audience, so maybe some of the basics of quantum science, and then some of the practical applications of quantum science. And it's not just quantum computing. There's many other kind of areas where it could, where we could benefit.
Yeah, so I think for me it was a natural progression in terms of what we were seeing in AI, and I think our work in artificial intelligence stems into two different directions. One is current AI, yes, does very well. I think we have ChatGPT in front of us to look at. I've even stopped calling myself Chief Innovation Officer after ChatGPT came up because I don't know what to innovate now, right? So you can ask every question to ChatGPT and they will answer, right? So that's one part of it. But I think at that point, people don't realize that even today, the artificial intelligence and AI that is being used, ChatGPT does hallucinate. There is it does very well, but it does hallucinate. There's a large amount of energy resource that is still being used to train some of these models. And we have also seen that the order at which this energy and the computation power is using, it may not be fruitful in going longer term. So one of the things that my lab does is also fundamental research in terms of neuroscience inspired AI. How can we take some of the facets from what human brains think? And we don't want to create, and I want to make a disclaimer, we don't want to create a sentient being. The idea is we look at the neocortex facet. We look at what is the intelligence part of the human brain. And can we pick up some of those facets to bring out intelligence within AI, but at a lesser cost, at a lesser compute value? And also this computation and cost value also makes sense because we're sitting in India. We don't have excess, enough amounts of R&D funds within the country, and we are not going to spend that amount of R&D funds within the country as well. So we want to look at certain alternative options as well. Quantum, of course, happened to be a subject that I was studying for long. But I think quantum computing and quantum systems or information systems made it more practical. And for our viewers, I think quantum is nothing more than looking at, if you look at science in Newtonian mechanics, right, where you and me are sitting over here, we can call it as Homo sapiens logic or monkey logic. For us, everything is deterministic. If I'm talking to Stephen, I'm actually determining that my voice is actually going to Stephen and he's hearing it. Quantum is much more probabilistic, and it's not deterministic in a lot of sense, which really means that if you go deep down and take a micro lens in terms of subatomic particles, you don't know where they are, or you don't know what their position or their momentum is at one point in time, and you're not determined about that particular subject. That is a problem, but that also gives the ability for us to use them for our purposes in the classical world, which we call as the Homo sapiens world. So in transistors or the PCs that you're made out of, these transistors can have only one value, 0 or 1. Whereas in quantum world, they are a probabilistic graph of where 0 or 1 could be. So they could be in superposition of both 0 and 1. So I can use 2 bits or 2 qubits, as we call it, instead of 1. And that gives us immense power, right? If I've got 32 qubits, I can use 2 raised to power 32, and I've got 64 bits in my system. I could use 2 raised to power 64, which is roughly the amount of stars in the Milky Way galaxy, right? So you've got the power of stars with you. Now, how do you utilize it, right? So fundamentally, there are still some classical problems which are not being solved, and which are not solved enough, right? So if I take 20 people and give them ideology of their race, their gender, their color, their ethnic preference, or their political preference, and if I increase these factors by a large number, I would not be able to still decipher classically or in my own way in my computers using the best supercomputers as well, to arrange them in a specific order. That's a huge problem of optimization. And I think that's where quantum and some of the work that quantum can do can really help us. Number one. Number two, quantum is also being used for security, right? So because large amount of security is actually built in on mathematical functions, and there's a huge speed up with quantum. Quantum has the power to break this phenomena, right? And then we are almost at the cusp of it. There are some claims from China that cryptographers have broken some of the algorithms as well. So it makes sense for us to look at this. So from a quantum world, we know that there is optimization, there's machine learning that they can help in, there's cryptography, there's control and sensing, and also classical preparation they can help in. From Tech Mahindra's point of view, what we are focused is largely on optimization and machine learning, and some part in cryptography, right? So we want to make sure that we can optimize solutions better. We want to make sure that we can put customers under security in a much better way. And that's our major task. I hope I've done justice to explain what quantum is, but it's not a trivial science. I think mathematics makes it trivial. If you apply your own common sense logic, it becomes a little non-trivial for you to, for somebody to understand.
There's a lot to unpack. So I'm going to go back to the AI side, which you started with, because that's really quite fascinating, everything that's occurring on the AI machine learning side. But let's stick to the quantum side for a moment. I mean, you saw Google come out a few years ago when they claimed quantum supremacy because they solved a non-trivial sort of artificial problem, not a practical problem, but a non-trivial problem. And they claimed that a classical computer, even a supercomputer, couldn't do it within a reasonable amount of time, though IBM later came out and said, really, we could take a supercomputer and we can use a quantum algorithm on a supercomputer and solve that problem as well, right?
Yeah.
So, but there's been all these claims out of China and others where, again, they're taking these non-trivial sort of, not applications, but examples of quantum speed up. And you have NIST, putting out a challenge a few years ago and saying, you know what, we're afraid of the ability of quantum capabilities of breaking encryption. So we want you to work on things that are quantum safe. And in fact, there are now sort of standards, draft standards out of, or I guess even gone beyond draft standards from NIST, this sort of standards institute out of the US. And you have people like Honeywell and others who are making enormous strides. In fact, I talked to the gentleman who actually heads up quantum for Honeywell, but they through a company called Quantinuum. And he indicated that I believe they're going to solve some condensed matter physics problems with quantum this year, which means that has application. That has real applications, right? Because that's behind semiconductors. It's behind superconductors and so on. So now we're getting into practical applications. So there's some controversies though. Some people are coming up and saying, no, we're never going to be useful. But that crowd is becoming smaller and smaller. And others are saying, you know what, we're going to have universal quantum, that sort of the ability to apply to any sort of a big optimization problem and not just these narrow niche areas, and be practical and be better than classical computing. So in your mind, because you're in the middle of it, you're driving this innovation, you're one of the top thinkers in the world in this area, and to do it in a translational way. do you think it's still 30 years out, or are you amongst the crowd who are thinking, you know what, I think we're going to get a universal quantum by 2035 or 2032 or something like that? Do you think it's more in the near term or still in the far term?
No, no. So for me, it's near term. So I think I also made a prediction about 5 or 10 years back, and I've not changed it. And 5 years back, I made a prediction that I think quantum would enter into every IT services and every boardroom by 2025. And we're still in 2023, and we are seeing that movement happen. So I'll still hold on to my prediction. I'll talk to you in 2025 as to whether that stays or not. But I think it started happening, Stephen. I think, and I think some of the use cases are getting solved right as we talk. I don't want to confuse people by saying there are two mechanisms of quantum. One's, of course, the universal quantum computer, which looks at gates like our system does. But there's another called Annealer, which is actually doing a lot of optimization-based issues and solving. But if people want to understand use cases, I think there are many. If you go to supply chain, media and telecom, transportation, utilities, cybersecurity, healthcare, drug discovery, fraud detection, inventory management, right? I can keep on naming them. You call them, there are now ways and means for us to maybe not solve it in a productionized way, but maybe solve it in a much more optimized manner, which is today happening. Funnily enough, I think people are not realizing most of the quantum scientists now are turning their attention towards generative AI these days. And the reason for that is that some of the quantum-inspired techniques are now making AI better. And one of them, very good technique is about tensor networks. Right? For example, machine learning and deep neural networks have large amounts of matrices and connections between them. Can we use quantum techniques of tensor networks and contraction to apply it on machine learning systems, make them much more compute friendly? Similarly, you talked about Continuum. I've actually read about them. They've done something wonderful. They've actually also reduced the kind of depth of their circuits that they build in, using something which is which is fundamental maths, which is called ZX calculus, right? That's what they're essentially trying to use in Continuum. So I think it's nowhere in the future. And I keep talking, it's right here. People are already working about it. I think it's not talked much because the science probably is not understood much. And people still think it's actually black magic in terms of what you're doing with quantum. But what we tend to do, and what my group also does, and I'm part of a circle in India, where one of the first things that we've realized is, can we give this as a courseware or knowledge sessions for our people? Talk about it within the industry, talk within the academia, let kids realize that it's going to be, when they enter this world, it's not going to be simple AI and simple things that we do today. It's going to be very, very different. And I think quantum would produce that revolution. So for me, it's near term at any point in
time. Because of this near-term aspect, then, are you working on producing content online or courses? I know IBM has these challenges, and kids actually create quantum circuits and things like that. Yes. I mean, I think that's amazing, right? And are you doing that in India as well, and sort of try to make it more universally available from an education standpoint?
So we are not in that field, so we don't create that content, because I think content from IBM and some of the universities like IITs, etc., are pretty good, and IIT Madras. And there are a lot of kids who are actually taking this education. What we are doing is, we are actually giving interns that come to my lab some of the projects based on quantum, because that gives them, to your saying, it's the translation facet. How can some of the science which is evolving and you're right at the cusp of science, right? This is just like 1950s and 60s when AI was evolving in Dartmouth College. You're actually right there. It's not fully evolved. There's some apprehensions with AI like there was, but it's still right there at the cusp. If you start handling to that science at this point, then you actually get much more better. So our job has been, of course, translational facets of research, but some of these interns learn this when they come to the lab. But we also take these lessons, right? So, for example, I'm a professor of practice in some of the universities, and I actually teach them the art of making quantum much more practical, right? So I can go through the theoretical facet, but I think what they like is if I show them a use case saying, look, this is what the art of the possible could be. And I'm not saying it's there, but it could be the art of the possible using quantum and quantum computing. So that's what our effort is all about.
It's interesting too. I mean, a lot of quantum is based on, low temperature, right? And do you think we're going to get into high temperature quantum materials in some way? And so that you don't have all of that sort of refrigeration necessary. And in fact, I think there's even people in India that are working on pristine graphene, and they're seeing some indications that they can, at room temperature, do superposition and entanglement, but they still have to work on the engineering side, and they're doing this at room temperature. So the promise of room temperature would be, would then make it so widely available, right?
No, it would, but I think I know LK99 is the flavor of the season these days, and I think people are discussing whether superconductivity could come in at room temperature or not. But it has
Excuse me.
sparked a kind of debate anyways. I don't think that's important. I think I think the yes, it's a scientific pursuit to get it into room temperature at some point in time, because who wouldn't like a quantum computer sitting on their desks trying to run it with like a normal PC or whatever. But I think the mechanism still works, whether you use a refrigerator or not. And I think I would still be very happy if refrigerators are used. And at least our quantum computers, which are available, right, likes from IBM's and Google, are at least error-free in terms of what we are trying to do, so that we can at least run our calculations on top of it. I think that will be the biggest achievement if we can do that in the next decade. If we do that, I think the decade after this, which is my kids growing up, and looking at what the world is, I think that's where we'll probably look at reducing the size of computers, and getting away from refrigerators, like we did with normal computers as well. But I think I'll be very, very happy if we actually reach the error correction facet within this decade. So we've done quite a bit. I think if you do single qubit or single gate-based calculations, they're largely error-free. They're 99.9% error-free, which is great. But I think if you increase the number of gates to it, the error still persists. And I think if we can solve that issue, it doesn't matter whether it comes in room temperature or not.
Yeah, and you believe that issue is going to be solved within the next decade, right? So
I believe so. I think so. I think maybe faster, Stephen.
Yeah, and as you indicated, you made a prediction a number of years ago that 2025 was
For me, that's the year.
And that's bold. It's interesting. I made something very similar. I was asked by a group of 100 CEOs that at that time happened to represent 92.7 trillion in assets under management. And they said, Stephen, can you predict and help us 10 years into the future? This was back in 2015. I said, you got to pay attention to quantum computing, because it's going to have a major impact on your business. So I'm in your camp. I think it's more near term than long term, or even medium term. So
no. Or otherwise, we'll be doing an interview in 2025. We'll be saying, look, it didn't happen, but we'll give you the next 5 years to happen as well.
Well, as you mentioned, it's already happening, right? I mean, there are these use cases in optimization and logistics and communications and then the cryptography that are already happening now in some fashion, right? So, and then even applications, in terms of drug discovery and so on, people are looking at these not at a mass commercial scale, but they can see the promise and new energy materials or new things Absolutely. Like that. So it's creating a lot of excitement. Okay, so I really love that topic. In fact, we could just do a whole interview on quantum. But earlier you mentioned AI, and you're an expert in AI and machine learning, and we've gone through AI winters, and then you had Jeffrey Hinton, Ilya Sutskever, and others in his team in 2012. They did this ImageNet thing, and they had such radical improvements in performance that everybody took notice, and then people kind of switched, right? And you have this deep neural networks, and that just sort of spawned this idea of transformers, and then from there we have large foundation models. Can you talk about your perspective of this kind of history of where AI has come and where we are today with large foundation models? So give us a little bit of history, and then we'll talk about where we are today, and then where we're seeing that going. So first of all, your perspective of history, because you're one of the world's leading experts in translational science as applied to AI and machine learning. So
yeah, so I've seen it very, very closely. I've actually, my tries with AI started off in 2003-4. And I think by that time, a lot of work had been done, but I think we were still going through AI winter. 1990s it started, and 2010
right.
it probably the winter got over. But I think from a history perspective, what I know is, before times 1960s and 50s is where AI started. Of course, the term AI itself was very misnomeric at that point. But anything that can be relegated to artificial systems was considered AI. And I don't think we have at least till ChatGPT was there, we don't have anything which is truly AI or artificially intelligent. I think they're all machine learned, and that's where the distinction really happens. And it happened for me as well, saying, look, they're all machine learning based systems. Yes, it's a subset of artificial intelligence, but it is not real AI as well. I think the next biggest change was, of course, which is considered as part of history, was Turing test. And we do explain them to a lot of people. By today, or as we sit today, Turing test is almost done with. And ChatGPT has proven that. But I think for a long period of time, when I was dealing with AI, I think Turing test was probably the pinnacle that you wanted to reach with your systems. And for people who are listening to it, Turing test is very simple, right? So, like I am talking to you, if I don't talk to you and I put a veil and I don't and I start talking and having this conversation, and by the end of the conversation, if I don't know whether I was actually talking to Stephen or a machine that's posing to be Stephen, then the machine seems to have passed this test. And by that definition, I think ChatGPT has actually broken all sorts of those test records. But I do feel Turing left a little bit of a flaw in the test. And I think that's where my journey starts. And that flaw is that, let's suppose I don't know any language. And I'm still talking to Stephen. And let's say Stephen talks to me in a language that is known to him only, maybe Chinese, maybe Hindi. And I still have a paper in my hand. And I know the questions that Stephen's going to ask. I just record the questions and I add the answer. And the moment Stephen asks me that question, as a human being also, I keep looking at my paper and keep answering him. At least I've also broken that test of machine. I've actually belied Turing test over here. So that flaw in that test really got me thinking, Stephen. And I was right in the middle of AI winter. And at that point in time, statistics was at its best when we wanted to deal with language. And my work has largely been with language. It has never been with vision. And I saw, and you could see the parallel lines, right? Vision was progressing quite well. Language did not progress that well because of so many things: disambiguation, understanding language. Natural language is very hard to understand. It is very verbose, to so on and so forth. To 2010, when I think we got the hang of GPUs, and thanks to NVIDIA and some of the others who gave us these graphical units to use them for large amounts of data. And I think that's really where AI progressed. And post 2012, we've been seeing wonderful items, right? I think 2012 onwards, we saw vision really taking shape. I still remember the paper from Feifei in 2014, where ImageNet really became one of the most pivotal sectors for you to improve vision. And vision, and at that point, the error rate at LGNet or VGGNet that was there in AI was just about 3.6%. And I think human beings also have an error rate of about 3.5, 3.6%. So we almost were there with vision. But I think the real change for this world, and for at least for my group of people who were doing AI, came in 2017. And 2017, when the paper really came from Google or DeepMind, which was attention is all you need, was the paper that really changed the way we look at transformers, we look at how we look at language. And the resultant is today, after 6 years in 2021, 22, or 23, where we are seeing ChatGPT and the likes, and there's a whole plethora of what we can do in languages. But I don't think that's the future for AI. I think it's good. We've reached a certain point. I think we have, in this process of making AI much more better, we have used a large and a vast amount of resources, computing, and also created a large amount of carbon. So we are not sustainable, right? And one of the reasons for me going into quantum as well was the sustainability facet. The whole phenomena of quantum computing is reversible. in a way, right? So and when Turing and some of the others defined this framework, it was not reversible. You take a group of instructions, you send it to a tape, or let's say a machine like us in CPU, you get an answer, but you can never recover the input back from the same output. I believe that the future of AI is much more aligned with how the human brain thinks. I think there are still algorithms to go, and for if kids are listening and people who want to pursue AI, I think it's still not finished. We're still at the very tip of the iceberg. We don't know there's a big chunk of ice still under that covers, which needs to be uncovered for AI. So I think that's the future for AI. But I also believe that AI and quantum would go hand in hand. There will be a large amount of techniques from quantum computing that we would utilize for AI internally as well. And AI may progress into a very different field, which is which we call as neuroscience inspired AI, brain inspired AI, so on and so forth. So that's the future. But I think we are at a precipice, and it's lovely to be here because I can see that, I can envision that, I can imagine what that world would be when this happens.
I mean, it'd be interesting when Gemini comes out, right? Because Google absorbed DeepMind into their main structure,
Yes.
right? And they combined the sort of the brain project with the DeepMind project, and we really combined them into one. And now there's this next generation called Gemini coming out this year, which is an advancement over Palm 2 and Bard, but something further. And then you see these patents being filed by OpenAI on GPT-5 now. So in this multimodal and maybe planning and memory and all of these things that we used to think were exclusively kind of human oriented, and then on this this massive multitasking language understanding, this MMLU test.
Yes.
These things are performing human-like, expert-like, and perhaps even better if you tune it, right? Like, you self-reflection and using these kind of different, these tree of thought, but, all of these different kind of techniques, it seems like you can get really a lot of optimized performance out of these things. So it's pretty exciting times, and you're in the middle of this. So it'll be
But they still hallucinate, right? So when ChatGPT came out in 2021, I tried this, right? So I said, I have seen pink elephants fly. And of course, GPT was still learning at that time. It says you're either hallucinating because there are no pink elephants, they don't fly. And I suddenly remarked, I said, look, my wife says pink elephants fly. If my wife's saying it, it must be true, right? So, and ChatGPT responds by saying, oh, I'm so sorry. If the wife says so, it's absolutely true, right? So imagine how, they are hallucinating. They're also, you're also playing with them. It's quite playful in terms of what you're doing. But I think one thing that we are missing out in big way is the responsible facet of AI, right? So I think this is quite about good talk that we can do and we can play with that. But the responsible facet is something which needs to still take care of. And I don't think by giving huge amounts of data to it, we'll be able to solve this problem, because data would always have that kind of bias. So I think that's still to go at this point.
Yeah, or the paper coming out that there's so much synthetic data out there that maybe even the synthetic data can degrade what's happening with this. And because of all of that data that's on the internet's being generated by AI, that in itself will degrade the model. And or you see all of this open source coming out from Llama to Llama 2 to Alpaca from Stanford, and then you had Vacuna and Orca and so on. And you could put this on your laptop. I mean, it's just amazing. Yeah. And you can train it for like $300 and not the 100 million plus that these large, very large language models. So it's just a fascinating time, right?
You're right. I think my friends from IBM were actually remarking, when we used to do AI, they were good stochastic parrots. They're now better, but they're still stochastic parrots.
But you also talked about, modeling more on the neuroscience side, and there's advancements in neuromorphic computing, right? And the ability to model what's using resistive RAM and things like that, right? So and modeling really what's happening in the brain. And in fact, there was a paper that came out recently where they're even able to model what's happening in some aspects of these large foundation models, large language models, biologically, in the astrocytes and the brain cells. So it's really quite fascinating. So do you think on the hardware chip side, outside of quantum computing, that that neuromorphic computing side will get to a point where it's sort of competitive with the algorithms that are running and things like that?
Yeah, I think it would be competitive to that extent, but I think neuromorphic computing would come in at some point in time. But the reason for that is the theoretical facet is still not clear. I think from a quantum science perspective, the theoretical facet is very well taken care of. And that's why it's about translating into some kind of a machine to do that, which is the quantum part of it. I think from a neuromorphic side, we're still studying the brain, right? So it's such a unique concept if you study more. That's probably one of the best supercomputers that God has given us, right? In terms of what we have on this, between these skull and our eyes. But the more we study, the more we get so much of information about how it operates. Because I can tell you a few facets, right? So you look at a neural network, we've always learned when we teach our kids and kids in college, neural network, there's a forward pass, something happens because of non-linearity, there's an activation, it goes to the other side. There's a back propagation. Some people have made this as back propagation through time in recurrent neural networks, so on and so forth. But what you notice is from a fundamental facet of neural networks, there's no time philosophy built in. There's no sequence built in. Whereas human brain has always looked at sequence in a very different way. It's the connection of neurons. It's the memory that happens in synaptic functions. It's the long-term memory that happens in hippocampus. We've always looked at sequences, and we've also concocted on sequences. The brain can actually concoct imagery when something as an experience never happened to you. I think that's a fundamentally very different concept to what we think about mathematical machines rather than analog machines, which is the human brain. I think that combination, and once that theory gets formulated, we'll be in a much better position to put it on chips as well. But yes, this field would grow
on. I did an interview with Clarice Aiello, and she's doing work on quantum biology, which is really sort of the outlier part of, and it's really fascinating quantum biology because she's saying that there's quantum effects happening in organisms, organic organisms. Do you think quantum effects are happening in our brain as well?
I don't have a clue, but I think I've read a little bit of that research, but not from Clarice. I've read from somewhere else where quantum biology is taking shape in terms of photosynthesis,
Right.
because the mechanism of transporting light into something as an element, right, where it actually gets transformed into food, is actually entanglement at some point. Then I know that quantum biology happens in, and it may happen, right? It's happening in birds and migratory birds, because the fact that migratory birds never lose the position or the location where they have to go is happening because of that entanglement and the small particle entanglement. I'm not sure whether that happens or not, but I think there's a hint of something happening between human brains using quantum biology, but it's not clear. So I wouldn't like to comment on it. But I think at one point in time, this was a point that we are made out of fluidic substances. Quantum would not survive. You need absolute stillness. You need you need no disturbance for quantum particles to work. I think that myth has been taken away by quantum biology, and I am hoping that they find out something in the brain is quantum, right? So, and you are saying that my connection with you or your connection with someone else, and when we say, look, I like the vibe, is there a quantum entanglement of particles, right? When we say that, so something like that.
Or I guess we can get into sort of the philosophical elements. I mean, the Indian history and culture of civilization and thinking predates anything in the West, right? And and there's a lot of discovery of knowledge and sort of embedded in your culture. Do you think this intersection of your past civilization and continuing civilization, that there's lost knowledge there that's going to be embraced into the future?
You've picked up a very interesting topic, and I don't want to spend an hour discussing this, but I think there's already some realms of discussion happening as to how quantum consciousness may have been devised based on some metaphysical format in terms of what we have been in the philosophy. But I think there's no scientific proof to it. There's no numbers that I can attach to it. But I think some discussions have started happening in terms of what that could be. And I think the quantum fields open up. In fact, I get visited by a lot of, and we call them Vedic scientists, because they understand the Vedas and they know and they've extracted a lot of information. So my lab has a special place for these Vedic scientists. And that's something that we are actually doing. These guys come in, we tell them about the scientific facets of quantum. And in some way, they try and relate it to the philosophical connotation which is being put into some of these old scriptures. But there's no scientific proof as yet, Stephen. Something that can come out in the world and say, look, there is a connection. I don't think that has happened. But this is just very early days in terms of what this revolution could be.
Maybe the entire universe is a fabric of quasi-entangled superposition powers and particles, or wave particles, which, and then that everything else is a projection, right? Including time.
Yeah, and we have one facet of it within the philosophy. I think the facet of it is that you and I are not made of hard structures like bones and skin. We are actually manifestations of energy. Right. In India, we actually call it the Maya. But I think the energy is nothing but another way of saying that it's an accumulation of a large number of wave functions into one common structure. Right? And that is the structure that we can see. So some connection. But that's a very, very long topic, right? So that's a congress on science and spirituality that we should be doing, right? So,
I could go on for hours with you. You're so interesting. Really enjoying this interview, but we're at our last couple of minutes. So, and this is just the final question, and that is, based on everything we talked about, what are your final thoughts? And beyond that, then, what are your final recommendations to the audience?
I don't have recommendations. I think my final thoughts is that this is a very, very fun interview, and I think this can go on for hours. And I think I would recommend that we have it much more in terms of longer duration with people talking about the science, spirituality, quantum, because these fields are just intermingling. And I think that is very important for us. I think recommendation for people is be you or be yourself. Just have the courage to step out and do something very different. I know there'll be brickbats. I know people would not like it. I think that's the facet that you have to encounter.
But Nikhil, thank you for coming in. You just... the work you're doing is just amazing, and you continue to make just huge contributions, and I really encourage the audience to follow everything you're doing because it's just marvelous. So
it's a pleasure, Stephen. Thank you.
So thank you again.
Bye-bye. Take care, Stephen. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.